Let's now take a more detailed look at how requests are dispatched onto ASP.NET endpoints in each of the respective versions of IIS you might encounter. This is important to understand as you deploy your ASP.NET sites because there are things you might do slightly differently, implementing your handlers or deploying your modules, depending on which version of IIS you end up deploying to. Now, the good news is everything that happens inside of the worker process with respect to ASP.NET right in here, that's going to be the same regardless of which version of IIS you end up deploying to. And that's where we're going to be spending most of our discussion in this module. But again, I just want to start off by pointing out some of the differences between the various flavors of IIS so that you don't get surprised by things happening differently. So in IIS 5, request comes in. Here's our GET request. The ASPX endpoint is going to have an entry in IIS with a script map association, creating mapping from ASPX onto the ASP.NET ISAPI DLL. Okay, that's the ISAPI extension that's registered for ASP.NET endpoints. And the request is going to be handled by IIS's worker process. In IIS 5, that's inetinfo.exe. And it's going to be a separate process from the ASP.NET worker process, which is by default ASP.NET_WP.exe. So they actually had to set up some inter-process communication here in the form of a named pipe connection, so that when the request is processed by the ISAPI handler, it will dispatch it via the named pipe connection over to the worker process, at which point ASP.NET takes over and begins locating the endpoint and processing the request. And then at the end, ASP.NET needs to funnel that response back over to IIS so it can serve up the response back to the client. Now, a couple things of interest here that happen inside of the worker process. And again, this is going to be the same regardless of which version of IIS you're working with. But once the request is dispatched onto ASP.NET, it needs to identify the endpoint and construct an instance of the class that is capable of handling that request. And the way this happens by default for ASP.NET pages is there's a handler factory. In fact, it's called the page handler factory. And this guy implements the HTTP handler factory interface. And its job is going to be to identify whether there already exists a compiled version of that class in memory. Has the assembly been loaded? Is that type already in the worker process? And if it's not, we need to go construct it. So the first time you get a request for a new endpoint, a new page, it's actually going to go out to the disk and locate that file, the foo.aspx in this case, and that's then going to be parsed and compiled into an assembly, and we saw this in our earlier discussions. And the assembly is then going to be dropped onto disk, and then the assembly is going to be loaded into memory, and the page associated with that file, foo_aspx in this case, is going to be instantiated, and it will have its process request invoked on the HTTP handler interface. So all those pieces will have to happen the first time, but subsequent times the assembly will already be loaded in memory, the type will already be available, so all that will have to happen is the handler factory will simply call new on an instance of foo_aspx in this case and dispatch the request onto a fresh instance of that class. Okay, so that's the procedure in IIS 5. When you switch to IIS 6, a couple things change here. Again, most of the internals for ASP.NET are going to stay the same, so you don't have to worry about doing anything different there. But inside of, or outside, when the request comes in, it's no longer handled by a separate worker process. So keep in mind that IIS is hosted in the same worker process as ASP.NET, and that in this case is w3wp.exe. And the request is actually going to be serviced from a kernel level HTTP listener that is built into Windows Server 2003 and higher, and that will decide which worker process to dispatch it onto. The ISAPI extension is still registered here, and that is important in IIS 6, so it knows which it still supports the ISAPI interface, which is the only way to extend it sort of at the lowest level. And again, ASP.NET has done that. So this is how requests are dispatched onto ASP.NET. They go through the ISAPI extension, even though it's in the same process now, and the ISAPI extension will then dispatch it onto an ASP.NET handler factory. Okay, and the rest of it stays the same. And then the only difference in IIS 7 is that we no longer have the need for the ISAPI DLL, because the ASP.NET is again a first-class citizen here. So when a request comes in through the kernel level HTTP listener onto the worker process, it actually will just go directly to the page handler factory, the object that implements the HTTP handler factory interface, and that will dispatch the request onto the endpoint. And again, the same stuff happens over here that happened before, the whole parsing, compiling. The first time, but then subsequent times it'll just load it directly from memory. So this IIS 7 obviates the need for the ISAPI model if you don't want to use it. You can simply map things directly onto managed classes in ASP.NET.